Section 6 of Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Mrs. Annie Wittenmyer. Getting 2,000 Sick and Wounded Out of Helena, Arkansas. On the 10th of August, 1863, accompanied by my secretary, Miss Mary Shelton, now Mrs. Judge Houston of Burlington, Iowa, I started on my return trip to Vicksburg with a heavy shipment of hospital supplies. The Van Fool, the steamer on which we took passage at St. Louis, reached Helena, Arkansas, on the 16th of August. When the boat landed at that post, we found, on inquiry, that there were over 2,000 sick and wounded there, and so stopped over with a part of our supplies, the rest going on to Vicksburg, where I had a covered barge that had done duty on the Yazoo River during the siege, but which was then lying at the wharf of Vicksburg. We found the hospitals at Helena, if they may be called hospitals, in a dreadful condition. The Methodist and Baptist churches were crowded with very sick and severely wounded men. There were very few cots in these two churches; most of the men were lying in the narrow pews, with the scant uneven cushions for their beds. The weather was extremely hot, and flies swarmed over everybody and everything. The faces of some of the men, who were too helpless to keep up a continual fight with them, were black with swarms of hungry buzzing flies. A few pieces of mosquito bars were spread over the faces of some of the weakest patients; but, lying loose over their faces, they were of little advantage. Barrels in which had been shipped pickled pork now served as water tanks, and were placed near the pulpit. They were filled every morning with the tepid water of the Mississippi River. There was a barge of ice lying at the landing, brought down on purpose for the sick; but I could find no one who had authority to issue it, and so it was slowly melting away under the blaze of an August sun. The men in charge were, however, willing to sell, and I had money to buy; and soon great crystal cakes of Northern ice were floating in every barrel of water in every hospital in Helena. Acres of tents had been pitched by the roadside, and the mud that in the winter had made the streets and roadways almost impassable had now turned to dust, and every breeze sent it in clouds into the faces of the sick and wounded men. There was another camp, called the Convalescent Camp, on the sandy beach of the river, the water being very low at the time. We found no convalescents there. The sun beat down on the white tents and glistening sand till the heat was like a furnace. Just back of these hospital tents and churches, there was a wide cypress swamp, stagnant and green and deadly. The men were discouraged. "We have been left here to die. No man could recover in such a place as this," was the verdict of all who had the strength and courage to express their feelings. The air was heavy with the deadly malaria, that ladened every breeze with poison. It was good service to provide them with light hospital garments to take the place of their heavy soiled clothing, and with delicate food to take the place of coarse army rations. But as one man said, "It's no use, ladies. We are all doomed men. It is only a question of time. Your efforts will only prolong our suffering. We are all the same as dead men." For 2 long days, through sun and dust, we went from hospital to hospital, till we too became hopeless. Every wrong that they had suffered, every peril that had threatened them, was burned into our hearts and brains, till they became our own. There were no high officials that we could appeal to. General Steele was pushing the Confederate forces toward Little Rock. There was no one having authority nearer than Memphis, Tennessee, and I determined to go to Memphis and invoke the help of the authorities there. I waited for an upbound steamer all night. I could not sleep. My heart and brain and blood seemed to be on fire. Thousands of despairing, suffering men were all around me. It seemed as if sleep had forever left my eyes and slumber my eyelids. All night long I waited for an upward bound steamer, and while I waited I wrote letters to the wives and mothers of the men who had asked me to write for them. About daylight a boat came up from Vicksburg bound for St. Louis, and I boarded her for Memphis, leaving Miss Shelton at the house where we had taken board, to complete the task of letter writing. When I reached Memphis I drove directly to the office of the medical director. An orderly was the sole occupant of the office. He informed me that the medical director had gone out hunting, and would not be back till evening. I was greatly disappointed, as I had hoped much from him, but I was not discouraged. I decided to appeal to the commanding general. The adjutant general was the only person in the office. "I wish to see the general," I said, addressing the adjutant. "The general is sick to day and cannot see any one. Perhaps he can see you to morrow." "My business is important and urgent. I cannot wait till to morrow. Will you take a message to the general for me?" "I cannot do that, madam. The general is very sick, and I cannot disturb him, but perhaps I can attend to the business." Thus encouraged, I began in a very energetic manner a statement of the condition of the sick and wounded at Helena. In the midst of it the door opened, and the general stood before me. I took in the situation in an instant, realizing that, sick or well, or whatever his condition, he was the man who had the authority, and I immediately turned to him with the case. I pleaded for those men as one would plead for his own life, and I concluded with a definite request. "I want you, General, to send down 4 steamers immediately, fitted out with cots and supplies, to bring all these suffering men away from that death trap." He said that it should be done. "But, General," I continued, "I want the order issued before I leave this office. I want to go back and tell the men that the boats are coming. It may save some lives." "I assume, madam, that the order has been given," said the adjutant, "and I will promulgate it immediately." "May I depend on you to send the boats down there by to morrow noon?" "The boats will be there without fail." "Remember," I said, "I have no other appeal but the newspapers and the great generous people of the North who sustain them, if you fail." "I hope, dear madam, that you will make no mention of this in the papers. The boats will be there." These last words were uttered as he closed the door of my carriage. I hurried away as the steamer was coming in, and I desired, if possible, to get back to Helena that night. I felt a little more certain of the boat's coming because of my threat to appeal to the North through the newspapers, of which officials stood in some fear. There were, however, other reasons why I justified in putting the case in that way of which it is not best to speak now. I reached Helena at 11:30 o'clock that night, full of hope and ready to rest and sleep. The next morning, early, we were out in the hospitals, not for the purpose of distributing supplies, but as the messengers of glad tidings. And never did women go with gladder hearts to bear good news, since Mary left the tomb of her risen Lord, than we did that morning as we went from hospital to hospital telling the men the boats were coming. We went to the 2 churches first, and in each I took a position in the pulpit, and called out at the top of my voice, "Attention, soldiers! 4 hospital steamers will be here to day to take you to Northern hospitals." The effect was magical. Men who were lying seemingly half dead in their hopeless despair lifted their heads and questioned anxiously, "What did you say?" And the glad message was repeated again and again with the assurance that the boats would surely come. "Then I'll get well. Where are my shoes? Where is my hat?" And so we left them getting ready for the journey, and went from hospital to hospital with the glad message. In one tent by the roadside, a beautiful brown-eyed boy about 16 years old, after I had made the glad proclamation, questioned, "Is that so, lady?" "Yes, it is so. We are looking for the boats every minute." He slipped out of his cot, and kneeling beside it, he lifted his eyes heavenward, and the tears running down his face he repeated over and over, "Thank God! Deliverance has come at last." In one ward, a man looked at us very earnestly, and then questioned, "Is it the truth ye are telling us now?" "Yes, it is the truth." "Now, surely, ye wouldn't be after desavin' a poor sick man that's most dead with the heat, and the flies, and the cypress swamp, would ye now?" "No, sir, I would not." My anxiety was intense. What if the boats should not come? I stepped out of the tent and looked up the river, and there, in full view, the little fleet of 4 boats were coming around the bend of the river. We both cried out in our joy, "The boats! The boats are coming!" But tears of thankfulness almost choked our voices. The excitement was intense. No one stood on the order of his going. The surgeons were willing all should go, and desired to go with them, and they did. Every man who could, rushed for the boats. Some who were not able to walk managed some way to get from their cots and crawl out toward the boats. Oh, it was pitiful to see the helpless ones, the wounded ones who could not move, waiting with anxiety for their turn to be carried to the boats and pleading, "Please, ladies, don't let me be left behind." "No, no, don't be alarmed, you shall go," was repeated over and over. At last all were crowded into the 4 steamers, and the boats steamed away with their precious freight up the Mississippi River. We stood at the landing as the boats moved away. The poor fellows out on the guards tried to give 3 cheers, but the effort was a failure. We waved our handkerchiefs, and they waved their hats or their hands as long as the boats were in sight. What a load of anxiety and responsibility was lifted from our hearts! Gathering up the supplies still left over, we took the first steamer bound for Vicksburg. When we reached the conquered city, we found thousands of sick and wounded still crowded into the hospitals there, and we remained for some time ministering to them as best we could. The Clock at Vicksburg. Vicksburg was situated on a high bluff. In the center of the town stood the courthouse. On the courthouse tower there was a large white-faced clock that turned its 4 white faces to the 4 points of the compass. Very early in the struggle, while yet the army was on the west side of the river, the artillerymen of the Union army attempted to destroy that clock, and by stopping the time confused the enemy. There was quite a rivalry as to who should with shot or shell dash that clock to pieces. But somehow they could not hit the clock. The rivalry continued, and when the army environed Vicksburg there were 18 miles of batteries pointing towards the town and often turned towards the clock. Shot and shell flew thick and fast, riddling the flag that waved above the clock, tearing away part of the stairway below, and chipping the casement that enclosed it. But steadily the hours and days went by, till weeks lengthened into months, and yet the clock untouched and unhalting measured off time. After the surrender I climbed the broken stairs, and saw the damage the shot and shell had done. The framework was chipped all around. But I found out why the shot and shell could not hit the clock. Aunt Dinah, the cook, had said to me, "You ought to see our preacher. He's the powerfulest preacher in dis town, he is." I expressed a willingness to see him, of which I suppose he was duly informed by Aunt Dinah as he called the next day. He was a middle-aged man of strong muscular frame, and his face, which was black, was surmounted by a wealth of white hair. I found him very intelligent, and he gave me a great deal of information about the life in Vicksburg during the siege. At last I asked him how it happened that the colored people's church, a large brick structure, was in ruins. "Was it destroyed by shot and shell?" I inquired. "No, missus. No shot nor shell ever come near dat church. But you see we colored people us to go dere to pray, and we prayed mighty powerful for de Yanks and for freedom. Den de white people da comed, and den we had secret prayer. Somebody would say, 'We'll have a secret prayer,' den we knowed just what to pray fur. But the white folks, they 'spicioned what we was prayin' fur, and dey tore down the church." "And that stopped your praying?" "Oh, no, missus. Dat couldn't stop our prayin'. We just 'greed to pray when de town clock struck 12 night or day." "Why, our men tried to stop that clock. Hundreds of guns were turned upon it during the siege, but somehow they did not happen to hit it." The old man's face was radiant. The joy of his heart was shining through the black skin as he swayed and clapped his hands. "Oh, honey, dar's no happen about that. The good Lord he just put his hand over it and kept it goin' and goin' for us poor color folks to pray by." What perfect trust! It is easier to accept the theory of the old colored preacher than to explain why it was that the army, with a cordon of guns pointing toward that clock, did not reach the clock, or stop the regular swing of its pendulum, or the merry chimes of its bell. Mrs. Margaret E. Sangster and myself met at the house of a mutual friend, on the banks of the Hudson River, one beautiful cloudless day, and I told her this story of the clock at Vicksburg, and she immediately wrote the following poem: The Clock at Vicksburg, by Margaret E. Sangster. Month by month the shot and shell round the leaguered city fell. Through its fiery tropic air throbbed the anguish of despair. Stubbornly the fated gray struggled through each pallid day. Stubbornly the loyal blue fought the weary conflict through. High above the central square towered the old clock, white and fair. Steadily its iron tongue over strife and silence rung, till the sullen foeman swore, "They shall keep that clock no more." All day long with bated breath life looked steadily at death. Little ones forgot to play, Christians ne'er forgot to pray. Fair through all the siege it stood, that old clock, in sober mood, as though now and then 'twould frown on the sadness of the town. Whistling balls around it flew, black against the sky's deep blue. All untouched, it told the time, with a regnant, cheery chime, till the hour when victory broke the spell, the place set free. In the city's open square swarthy faces sobbed in prayer. Bless the Lord, the work is done! Bless the Lord, our freedom's won! By that clock in yonder street, true as steel our sad hearts beat. In our homes or by the way, when it struck, we paused to pray. At its noon hour, day by day, every bondsman stopped to pray. Was it strange that old clock stood, safe amid the storm of blood? Why, of course it could not fall, guarded by the Lord of all, who through choiring songs of heaven hears the cry of earth's forgiven. And till now its honest face is a witness of his grace. End of poem. Sharing poor quarters with Dorothy L. Dix. In the winter of 1864 65, the Union forces were concentrated in front of Petersburg and Richmond. There was more or less skirmishing and fighting all the while between the two great armies facing each other for the last desperate struggle. The hospitals were overcrowded at City Point and Point of Rocks. Every cot was occupied, every tent was crowded, and the thousands of troops coming down quartered wherever they could find a vacant place. I had not been in the cabin of a steamer bound for City Point very long till Miss Dorothy L. Dix came in. After the usual greetings, she informed me that she too was going to City Point. Miss Dix was the stateliest woman I ever saw, and she was very dignified in manner and conversation. Although at that time she was about 60 years old, she was tall, straight as an arrow, and unusually slender. Her hair, which was abundant, was very dark brown, almost black, and was combed and coiled on the top of her head, except 2 locks in front, which were combed smoothly over each ear and carried in a loop up over the coil on top of her head. This peculiar manner of dressing her hair seemed to add to her height and dignity. Her dress was always exceedingly plain, but neat, and her linen collar and cuffs were always immaculate. She wore no jewels, not even a breastpin. She required the same degree of plainness on the part of her nurses. It was not long after the boat left the dock at Washington till we had passed Alexandria and Mount Vernon, and were steaming on to Fortress Monroe at the mouth of the Potomac, with the ocean in full view. There was always a long stop at this point, as it was not only a strong military station, well fortified and strongly guarded by troops and gunboats, but it was a great hospital center. Thousands of sick and wounded lay sorely stricken in these great barracks and tents by the sea. It was about 9 o'clock that evening when we reached City Point. We had discussed the question of lodging before we left the boat, and Miss Dix had said, "I have no concern. There are always plenty of cots, and I'll find room in some of the nurses' tents," and she urged me to go with her. But I was equally confident, and assured her that the Christian Commission would take care of me. Mr. Cole, of Boston, the chief agent, was standing beside a tent, in deep thought, when I approached. When he saw me he lifted up his hand in dismay. "I have no place for you. Every foot of space is occupied," was his greeting. How about the little tent where I stayed the last time?" "It is full of delegates lying on the ground on their blankets. I've given up my little corner to Dr. , and have no place to sleep myself." "How about the storeroom?" His face brightened. "I never thought of that; but it's full of barrels and boxes, and is not in order." "No matter. There will be shelter and room, and there is a lock on the door, and I'll get on all right." A candle and some matches were procured, and, accompanied by the agent and his assistant, I went into the storeroom near by. It was a great, rough, strong plank barracks. Boxes and barrels were piled up nearly to the roof. There was a vacant space where they handled the supplies near the door. "There is not a cot on the premises. They have all been taken for the sick and wounded. What will you do?" "I'll sleep on the floor, of course," I answered cheerfully. But they turned some of the boxes around, and gathered up all the straw and shavings that were in sight, that had been used in packing, and put them together, and I placed my satchel for a pillow. And after I had assured them that it would be all right, they left, and I locked the door after them. They had not been gone 10 minutes till there was a knock at the door. I went very close to the door and called, "What is wanted?" "Mrs. Wittenmyer, Miss Dix is here, and she has no place to stay. Can she come in?" "Certainly. Of course she can." And I opened the door, and that stately woman, with all her dignity upon her, which was really a part of herself, entered, glad to find even such a shelter as that. My candle lighted up the building sufficiently to show its unsightliness, and the dust and rubbish that were all about us. As Miss Dix was old enough to have been my mother, of course there was but one thing to do, and that was to give up my bed of shavings and straw to her, and with the stub of an old broom try to clear a place on another part of the floor for myself. She generously offered to divide her bed; but there was not enough to divide, so I spread my blanket shawl down on the rough, uneven floor for my bed, and I took my satchel for a pillow. I was weary and anxious, and for a few moments I felt the service was too hard to be endured much longer. But there came another train of thought as I heard the booming of the cannon at no great distance. How glad the brave men on the picket line, where to sleep is death, the men in the trenches, and working the guns, would be to have a good dry floor to sleep on, and the right and privilege to sleep, I said to myself. Somehow my bed grew soft, and my pillow downy, and all the clouds of care and spirit of self-pity cleared away before the magic power of patriotism and sympathy for the brave men who stood so gallantly for my country and its flag. And I never in all my life had a better bed or a sweeter night's sleep. Hardships of Camp Life at Vicksburg. There was little level ground on which to camp about the lines. Excavations had to be made to get a level place to sleep. So all the bluffs around Vicksburg were catacombed to afford sleeping apartments. No wonder there was sickness. No wonder death held high carnival on both sides of the lines. It was not only dangerous, but almost impossible, to reach the little hospitals under the shadow of the guns. Very many times, driven at full speed, I reached them, but it was at great peril. How the memory of those hospital scenes comes back to me now! At one point I went down under the guns of the fort at one of the most exposed places, with a carriage load of supplies for the little fort hospital under the bluff just behind the heavy guns. I found when I reached there that the position was so dangerous that it would be madness, so the officers said, to try to get out of there till I could go under the cover of darkness. But the afternoon was well spent in making lemonade and ministering to the men who had been stricken down with fever and hardships. The ceaseless roar of artillery and scream of shot and shell; the sharp whiz and whir of small shot just over our heads; the June sun blazing down upon us with torrid heat, and no shelter for the sick but the white canvas tents, perched on the sides of the bluffs in places excavated for them, the bank cutting off the circulation of air, were almost unbearable. How the poor fever-racked heads and fainting hearts ached amid the ceaseless din and the dust and heat of these little camp hospitals! One poor fellow with parched lips and cheeks red with the fever that was burning through every vein said, "I got a little sleep a while ago, and I dreamed that I was at the old spring. but just as I was taking a good, cool drink I waked up." I partially met his cravings for a drink from the well of the old home by giving him generous draughts of lemonade, but when night came on I had to leave him. Poor boy, I never knew whether he got back to the old spring and home or not. There was no cool water there to allay his burning thirst. One of the hardships of that long summer campaign was the lack of good cool water. There were some springs, and a few wells were dug, but at points water had to be hauled long distances. Think of thousands of men to be supplied! Of the thousands of horses and mules, the great burden bearers of the army, that must have their thirst quenched. Most of the water for the use in camp was hauled up from the Mississippi River or the Yazoo, through the hot sun in barrels, and stood in camp all day. During that dreadful day I sat down in one of the tents for a little while. There was a patch of weeds growing near the tent door. I noticed the weeds shaking as though partridges were running through them. I called attention to the matter, which made the surgeon smile as he explained. "Why, those are bullets." "Bullets? Do bullets come so near as that?" "Oh, yes," he answered cheerfully. "They are flying around here quite thick." "Do you consider yourself safe while in this tent? It seems to me the bullets are coming very close." "It is considered very safe. The bullets fall a little short, you see." All the while I sat there I watched the bullets coming over and clipping through the weeds. 3 days from that time an officer was killed while sitting in the same chair on the same spot where I had sat and watched the bullets shaking the weeds. End of Section 6